we've got quite a large amount of subject matter to cover off today, and you may have already heard some of this content at the AGMs. However, what we're hoping for is that you're going to leave with a better understanding of what we need to achieve and that task at hand. I am going to start by introducing the FMNZ team. This was at our last work do, to be honest. But could the FMNZ team that are here today, our numbers are growing, so I won't introduce them individually, but if you could all stand up, please, wherever they are. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can just identify the individuals that are standing. They all work for FMNZ. They all play a part in what it is we do, and collectively have an individual role to play in that, and we're quite proud of their achievements. But during the course of the day, I do encourage you to engage with them. This is your conference and you've got to really ring it out for all it's worth. Thank you, guys. So the topics we're going to cover today, the task at hand, the planning process, some technologies, forest to markets, harvest reporting and replanting. The task at hand. Roger Dickie started syndicating forests back in 1989, and between 1989 and present we've established 26,000 hectares. During the 90s we had a significantly large pruning and thinning program, and in fact in 1999 was probably our single biggest year. We pruned and thinned 12,000 hectares in that year. That 12,000 hectares was probably for an individual company the single largest program in the country, and we're actually quite proud of what we've achieved there. We know it was bigger than Kaingaroa at that particular time. So an immense challenge, and the challenge we face now is probably just as great, but for different reasons. If I take you back to the pruning and thinning, during that period we had probably stricter timeframes to adhere to keep DOS and I guess the thinning in a timely fashion, but we had a greater labour pool. Now I guess that's changed. The trees continue to grow, and so we add more growth as they stay in the ground. However, the labour pool has drastically diminished. Okay, so labour at the moment is our problem. So we love Winston Peters' new planting model. Okay, FMNZ and our harvesting to date. We started harvesting in 2012. The reason we started in 2012 was to build up the policies and the processes for the main event, which is the RDL volume. In 2012 we were doing private woodlots, and we continue to do those private woodlots. But as you can see by the trajectory of that line, this is based on calendar year, and in 2017, by the end of December, our volume will be at that 350,000 mark, and that trajectory is going to continue upwards. So, yeah, it's all good stuff. Okay, at the 2014 Harvest and Beyond conference, we talked about starting the clear fell at age 28. Now, Roger's taken advice on this, and based on that advice with consultants, we've moved that program forward 2 years. So it's put us under a little bit of pressure by bringing that program forward. The main reasons for bringing that program forward were internal rate of returns, obviously improve as it's earlier. We've got extremely good growth rates in your forests, and we actually need to smooth that volume out. And I won't make a reference like Roger did to the grey power in the room and the want to harvest. Anyway, so this graph here, we've modelled the future wood flow based on an age class distribution of 26, and we've used our pre-harvest inventory data where we can, and our FMA data when that hasn't been available, to come up with these numbers. And you'll see that in 2018 we climb up to almost 2 million tonnes, and in the following year in 2019 it goes to just over 2.5 million, and then you've got that seesaw effect that's going up and down for the remainder. Now, no harvest, no management company can build an infrastructure around that. It's impossible. It just simply won't happen, and so we need to smooth that volume. So we've smoothed the volume out, and based on, I guess, about 24 to 26 harvest contractors, it'll look something like this. So in 2020, we move up to near that 1,400 tonne mark, and for the next 9 years to about 2028, it stays at that level. Okay, so that includes all our Hawke's Bay wood and our Gisborne wood, along with the Taranaki and the smaller volume that we've got in the southern North Island. So, yeah, we need to smooth that volume. It's vital that we do that, and that's how we've looked at it. It is quite ambitious, but we believe with the right attitude and on the basis we provide continuity to service providers, it is achievable. So how do we plan, I guess, for such a large volume? And given that it has moved forward a couple of years, we start with, I guess, strategic planning at about age 22. So this is a timeline of events. Okay, so the first part of that is consultation with stakeholders, shareholders, landowners like yourself. It's important that we engage with you so as you get an understanding of what we're trying to achieve. We've started this process over the last 2 or 3 years for those forests that are nearing harvest, so that's an important part of it. We also need to engage with territory authorities, make sure that they've got their roads and infrastructure in place and understand the resource that's coming on stream. Neighbours, iwi, they're all part of that planning process. Customers, where we intend the wood to go to, domestic markets and export, obviously. It's about building those relationships. It's also about available resources. So, where's the metal coming from to put the roads in? Who are the service providers? Where are we getting our harvesting contractors? So we start thinking about those things and start working on relationships early in the piece. From that point, we move into Lidar and mapping and PHI. Lidar is a very important component to understanding what the terrain is under the trees, and the mapping component, obviously, what the net stocked areas are. We use Lidar for engineering. Like I say, it's understanding that terrain. It's an important tool. Rory is going to talk on this a little bit later. PHI, pre-harvest inventory, it's about getting the data of what the resource is, so what value, I guess, what recovery we'll get as far as volume is concerned per hectare and the grade outturn. So that's what pre-harvest inventory is all about. From there, we move into the harvest planning. Like I say, these LiDAR tools are handy for that. Harvest planning is extremely important because you've got large expenses that come in to roading. So putting in the correct plan for the, and what crew configuration for each forest, what best suits it. It's about putting the roads in the right place, the skids in the right place, and trying to reduce the expenditure through good planning. From there, once we've got the plans in place, we move into the road line. That's about building the roads, the skids, and setting up the forests and their infrastructure to cater for the clear fell. And Rory's going to talk a little bit on that as well. And once that infrastructure's in place, we move on to the clear fell at about age 26. We have to remain relatively fluid around that, but that's the general timeline, about age 26. And then obviously post-harvest and beyond and replanting, which will be in a presentation a little bit later on. So I'm going to pass over to Rory now, and he's going to talk you through some mapping, LiDAR, and some technologies we use, and then I'll come back.
Excuse me if I make the transitions between the slides. So, hello everyone. Konnichiwa, ni hao, And for all our people overseas in Aussie, g'day mate. Just try to keep it unilateral around here. So what I'm going to cover this morning is a little bit of technologies that our company or FMNZ use. People have conferences on technology, so to cover it all off in the next 10 minutes would be a pretty tough ask. So really I'm just going to talk about some of the key things we're using and just try to give you a bit of an insight. But over the weekend, if there's anything you want to know from South or any of the others, just ask. So one of the, as Steve's got up here, is harvest planning. And key to the harvest plan, as apart from the stakeholder engagement, is the provision of good data for our planners. And some of that data comes in the form of topographical information, which is in the form of contours. Now in the past, contours were flown or from aerial imagery, and while they've been good and been sort of 5 metre contours with a gold standard, with the advancement in technology and cost efficiencies we've been able to get from it, Lidar is starting to become the new sort of normal for forestry in New Zealand. And one example recently, or 12 months ago, when Paul first started for us, he's done a lot of harvest planning over the years. We didn't have the Lidar in place, and he had 20 metre contours, and he is walking around the forest, and it was very hard for him to identify in the forest where the guts and the gullies are. As soon as you get the Lidar and the better contour data, it really speeds up those efficiencies. So that's the gains that we're starting to see is in the time-saving benefits by being able to understand what's out in the forest before you get there. So for the scale of what we got going forward in terms of the area we have to plan and manage, having that good data, really pays dividends. And that's, I guess, a fundamental part of what I have to do as part of our organisation. So what is LIDAR? It's an acronym for Light Detection and Ranging. It's relatively becoming commonplace, as I said, in forestry, but it started back in the 1960s when lasers first came about. So it's been around for a while, but it's only really becoming the new normal as prices start to decrease. So what it involves is special scanners inside usually fixed-wing aircraft, like the one in the bottom right-hand corner, or now more terrestrial handheld laser scanners. So the scanners, they fire pulses of light at an object, and when that light is reflected and returns back into the scanner, it is processed and given a classification. And if you can imagine, the pulses is firing at the speed of light, so you can get millions and millions of pulses and collections that are happening all at the same time. So if you ever wanted to visualise what a LIDAR pulse would look like, take a look at the picture in the bottom left-hand corner with the sun shining through the trees. If you can imagine, that's the light shining through and reflecting back up into that scanner and getting collected. So when it's combined with the GPS coordinates in the plane and measurements from the plane, such as pitch and roll angle, that is given a point classification. So what the LIDAR does is tell you the distance. So if we're firing something here, it'll tell you within sort of 30 centimetres, and if better, what distance you are away from the objects. Some of the uses for it currently are in the actual self-driving cars, such as the Google Drive car that, if anyone Googled it, you can look it up of what they're doing with the LIDAR. The main hindrance is obviously being able to get scanners portable enough to fit in those objects. So when the points are collected, and a collection of those points is labelled a point cloud. So for forestry, there's actually 25 point classifications, but the main ones we are interested in forestry is what's called the ground returns. So if we had more time and the ability, I'd show you what a DTM looks like with the LIDAR, but typically with the LIDAR imagery, it's being able to strip away the trees and the vegetation and being able to see the land that's underneath it. So if you have a 3D model of it, you're able to pick up a lot of detail. So it's effectively used in archaeology, and in some of our properties, we're able, once you key your eye in, you're able to pick up archaeological sites in those areas. So in some of our properties now that the guys are getting their eye and understanding it, they're able to use that to the DTMs to find those sites. On the picture here in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see this is the DTM from the Lidar, and on the bottom right-hand corner, apologies for the text box covering that, but that's the same area of land. But if you can imagine, that was taken before trees were on that land. And the picture in the background is from the same forest, and I've sort of cut it into 3 dimensions. You've got the vegetation classification showing through there, a power line, which is that sort of yellow reflected line through there, and then the ground underneath it. So where we intend to use it further is in, one, the cable harvest planning tools, and in road engineering. So previously, to do a road engineering survey would involve manually going out on the ground and doing cross sections and walking the areas. In a cross section you'd walk, and every deviation, that change in the topography, you'd have to identify that manually with the changes in the slope and the distance travelled. But with this LiDAR, we're able to do that now more in the office and field validate it. So the way the costs are reduced is primarily been on scale. When we first looked into it in 2013, it was around $20 a hectare, and it was for us far too expensive, even with the gains we can see. But now this year, we're flying it with Kaingaroa Timberlands. It's a 500,000 hectare project, and the costs are now around $4 a net stock hectare. So to put it in perspective, in the past 5 metre contours were around a very similar price. So the costs are really coming down. The limitations though, if you are flying with a large group like this, you sort of, to some degree, do have to get in line. So it does mean planning in advance, and this year we're thinking 5 years ahead, so we're flying the LiDAR for the next 5 years, so when our planning is being carried out, it ties in with that time frame. So we're actually ahead of the game with having that information available. The other limitations, and it's quite a key one, is it doesn't tell you what the soil structure is like and what happens with that soil. So local knowledge and getting out in the field is still very much important in it. But what it does mean is the tricky areas, the hard areas, are the ones the guys can target a lot more effectively. The second product is plot imputation. That slide there is probably a little bit heavy for some, just to try and understand what's going on, but basically plot imputation and our standard PHI would involve going out, putting in individual plots. You'd do a grid over your property, and you'd identify a percentage that you'd like to cover that would represent that forest. With regards to plot imputation, you do the same reference plots, but it can be done with a lot less in the forest. So you have a grid, which is your LiDAR. It's about 25 metre grid, which ties into the same size as your plots. And information from those trees and the plots with modelling metrics can actually be extracted over the whole forest. So what that means in terms of in our organisation is for the 10,000 hectares we've put into plot imputation this year, where we'd usually do 1 every 3, it could mean about 3,300 odd plots. We've had advice from the people who are doing the imputation. It brings it down to about 300 plots. So a real change in scale. It's starting to get uptake in New Zealand. In 2013, it was very much in the hand of researchers, and it was pushed for as a technique and technology that New Zealand can use in inventory. And now some of the larger companies, such as Kaingaroa Timberlands Australia, and I believe Summit Forests and Northland have undertaken this. Duke and Pampac are starting to more push towards the plot imputation as the means for their pre-harvest inventory. So once, in these couple of slides, I'll just cover the road lining process, and the reason I've put this in here is, I guess, something that is happening in a lot of the properties at the moment, and it is a question that comes up at our AGMs, just how does it happen? So I thought I'd just put a few slides in just to outline this, so a little bit away from technology, but still relevant nonetheless. So in the road lining, once everything's planned in the office and the team are happy, they'll identify that road line corridor out in the field, and they'll mark the area that needs to be cut and discuss that with the contractor. And the road line corridor we have got here, that's 30 metres wide, but it does vary depending on the situation. It can be wider or narrower, just depending on if you're leaving 2 or 3 trees here, it's better off to take that in terms of health and safety. The other thing is it's constructed in conjunction with the roading crew, and that's a challenge in itself, as you can imagine. So this corridor here is actually, a completed sort of job. You've got your forest still standing on the left and right hand side, the road metalled and the corridor cut. So I'll just go through a couple of pictures here of what's sort of happening. When it clicks. If it clicks. Oh, yeah. So the first stage is you've got your contractor here, he's in the forest, he's cutting the corridor, and when he's moving forward, it's in a staged process. The roading contractor follows after him. And if you can imagine, it gets a bit like this, and our role as managers is to try and mediate that solution. And you can't keep everybody happy, but have a solution that works for both parties. And it also involves having good efficient cartage. The roadline skid sizes are a lot smaller than your standard skid sizes, and moving that wood off quickly helps speed up the process. Paul has got a good analogy for how the transport system works that he'd be quite happy to share with you later on if you care to ask him. Right, so this is just a quick picture of the logs. This is on a forwarder system. Other systems is a skidder, a tractor that pulls essentially the logs back to the landing. So he's going in front, he's cutting the logs, they work out to a certain distance, might be 200 or 300 metres, depending on what area you've got to work back to, and those logs are taken back to the landing. Right. So then after that, you have the road line corridor that's cut and doesn't look too pretty, but road construction will follow after that. So as part of that harvest planning process, one thing we'll look at is the boundary locations. And in this situation, it's quite interesting is that it's actually on a shared road. And about 2 or 3 years ago at a conference, I talked about shared roading costs, and it is a bit of a prickly situation. It's quite interesting. Shared roading costs, there's a shared road through the middle there, and to the right-hand side is actually a boundary between another property. So this is on the Waia River Road between Cricklewood and Woodlands. So hopefully our video plays. Yep. So now this is the same section of road following that road corridor's been cleared. This section here has actually had an easement agreement over it. So the roading costs on here was shared pro rata, which is generally the common solution by volume of 60%, 40%. And this section to the right, as we go down the road, is known as East Road. In the harvest planning, we identified there'd be equal benefit in that. So this roading cost down here was shared 50-50. So those solutions, I guess, came about in the planning, and also in that identifying in the easement agreements what those costs would be shared by. And also coming back to that, the data that what's assumed for that comes back down to that inventory information that we have. So if we can have as accurate as possible information about what's there, that will bode well, or helps for a lot of it. So one of the other issues and the key issues or things to consider for us when we're doing this is keeping the logs separate from each property. And the way they do that is currently is by harvesting one forest, processing those logs, loading them out before moving to the next one. Because that's the key thing, is ensuring that the logs originating from one property still belong to the other, or still belong to that property. And the other key part there is working with good contractors who are diligent and close supervision. So if you see in the bottom corner there's actually a processor working, harvesting processor, and I'll just talk a little bit on mechanised processes. I have to admit, I'm not a subject expert on mechanised processes, and as you can see, I know enough to be dangerous, so I'll just give you a view of where we're going to be, where we're heading with this. So this is the same contractor standing next to his processor, and the processor is actually the head on the left-hand side of him, the red object there. There's multiple manufacturers in New Zealand. There's 3 sort of main ones, which is Satco, Waratah, which most people think of processors as being Waratahs, but that's the brand name, just like Ford and Holden. And then you've got Woodsman. So those are some of the main ones in New Zealand. So mechanised processors are now becoming so commonplace in forestry, and that is really around the efficiencies of what they bring to the table and the push to keep people in machines for health and safety benefits. They can produce large volumes in a very short space of time. We were with Waratah the other day, and they were saying an average operator, all things being equal, could process around 80 tonnes per hour in some of these things. So if you can imagine, if left unchecked, they can go a lot the other way. So what we're doing is now moving towards improving our quality control and making sure that what comes out of these things is good. So the processes can be divided up into 3 broad types, but I won't go into those too far, but they've got a value bucking optimizer, which is your sort of gold standard, a length preset, and a value bucking system. So the length preset is the contractor, the guy will be sitting in the cab, and he will have a cut plan of what grades he needs. He'll go out to a length, it could be 3.9 or 5.9 metres, and he'll assume what that grade will be, whether it be A grade, and cut that log. And he's making that decision in his head as he's going. So generally he's probably been log making, because the log makers stand to make the better processor operators. But as you can imagine, if you change operators or time goes on, those issues start coming to the fore. So where we are pushing to, with new contractors coming into the forest and contractors upgrading, is the push towards using the value bucking optimizer. So this is most contractors or systems have the software in their processors and is an upgrade. But what that means is it has a machine learning algorithm inside the computer system that stores information about previous grades cut. And so when the log is picked up, or the stem is picked up, based on the stem profile, it assumes before it even gets to the end of the log what grades can be cut out of there. And it works by having a priority grade list, and it works down that priority grade list and across the lengths. And so we see potential for that as being able to increase value. And currently we have 2 contractors who have that system in there, and that's where we're trying to push more towards. Some of the larger companies such as Nelson Forest and Ryanair are now moving towards that value bucking optimizer because of the ability to be able to, try and get as much value out of that log as possible, especially the way the New Zealand log grade market is. So, and the next slide is just a video of that system working, so I'll just talk to that. Actually goes, so hopefully it'll auto-pose. Right, so this one here is the delimbing phase, and there's no audio, so I'll just have to talk to it. So what he's doing now is just clearing the limbs off it, and when he gets to the end of the log, depending on the type of system, some they have a find end laser, and what that does is it sets the marker to 0 so the optimizer knows that that is the start of the log. And this one here, you can do a reference cut, and that'll be position 0. So when that log is picked up, it knows the SED of the log, and if you look on to the top right-hand corner, you can see the grades that it's predicting ahead based on that value system loaded into it from either the forest owner or from the supplier, depending on how that information's fed into it. So on the left-hand side, where the 613 is the length that it's cut, on the right-hand side is the SED, and in the middle there is the actual grade that it's cutting. So if you can see on the right-hand side, it's saying 3, so in millimetres, 303 mils, In the middle, the spec there is 300 mils, so that's the tolerance that system's going to. And thinking ahead, it's saying, well, okay, it can assume that these grades are coming forward. Under the current system, the log maker, he's processing and thinking that information, or having to process and think that information ahead of time before that turns up. So that's, we see if we can push more towards into that, where those gains can be made. There, as with anything that's mechanical, it obviously needs maintenance, and part of our quality control and quality checks is just ensuring the contractor is carrying out that regular maintenance. The regular QC checks of those logs are happening. Basically, it's one stem once a week as a minimum, and that's part of where we're heading, is to making sure that those things are happening, which we're working on at the moment. And as part, so once that log's come out, it's still QC checked on the ground to make sure that it is at specification. And possibly you'll see, probably not this type of system, but a processor working out there. So if you've got any questions on how that works, then fire them around. So the next one is UAVs. It's becoming a bit of a commonplace, and I guess you hear a few stories of UAVs, bad or good. The drone potential in forestry, I guess you could say it's huge, but is becoming more popular, especially as the consumer drones are starting to come into place. They can be purchased relatively cheap, DJIs from $1,000 to $3,000 with 2 batteries, and they're quick and portable. And the video that what I've been watching just on the left-hand side just shows a tagging application that can be hooked up to any app. That's a live video feed, and as you're flying along that video feed, you're able to tag either one, in this picture, the Roadline boundary, but you could also tag features as you're flying. So that's the live video feed from the drone. You can get out to about 500 metres before it starts playing up. They say 2Ks, but I think that's just marketing. So the picture underneath it, that's actually a mapped area from another type of drone, or from a drone. There's different applications that will process those images, but this was an interesting case. We needed to know the area. The drone was taken out in the morning, flown. The area was ortho-rectified, stitched, and loaded into Google Earth, measurements made and done by the afternoon. So, relatively quick. So cutover mapping is one application for drones that we've seen, and I think Science has actually done studies on different areas. So the next one is post-harvest waste assessment. As you can see, drones, they can get into all nooks and crannies quite quickly as long as you fly above the trees. It's a bit of a hazard if you're thinking about drones. Hence why Steve won't let too many people have our company one at the moment. Especially at $3,000. So yeah, you can get out to the corners of the forest relatively quickly. This one here, if we've flown down a road line that was taken out a few months ahead, but this area is the area flown. So just video images like this for the NES as we go forward, having that evidence of what's been done, it's important, and being able to keep that visual record and seeing it from another angle like that is quite important. So drones, for the consumer models, you get about 20 minutes out of a battery. So in 20 minutes, you could map 20 hectares. So yeah, they do have their purpose. Most cutovers about 5 to 10 hectares, and obviously mobilising between sites can really affect just the productivity, but we see good purpose of them. Going forward, I read a report in I think it's the Friday Offcuts, potential use of drones. One person said maybe drones will be the size of Boeings in 50 years. Who would know? Could they be used to lift logs out of the cutover? It would be quite good if they would do. They might solve a few of our slash issues. And some contractors are actually using them to fly straw line or rope. They're using a light rope, can take a payload of 14 kgs out 1 kilometre. In the past you'd use that with a helicopter, but now they've actually, one contractor's rigged a drone up to do that. Some people with the ones in this picture here have actually been able to have put LiDAR scanners on them, but they do. Obviously, everything comes at a cost. But as technology advances, who would know? So that's the end of my one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. I'll let you all decide whether that's a real human being in that hammock or a dummy. Anyway, I thought I'd just touch on economies of scale because Roy's just brought a few of, I guess, those details in his part of the presentation. Economies of scales and sharing of costs, you've seen that in that Roadline. That's a real advantage, I guess, to those partnerships that have the ability to do that in those larger groups where the forests are grouped together. It does create a real saving. However, for all the other individual forests, there is an economy of scale that you get out of the group. Now, LiDAR and plot imputation, Rory gave those examples there. There's an economy of scale there. But as a collective group, we've got a huge amount of power, I guess, in attracting workers. And on that scale, I guess we'll get the better contractors. It is our point of difference. We're not just large individual woodlot owners. We actually are a large group, and it's important that, in all negotiations with service providers, domestic mills, export, etc., we capitalise on that scale, particularly now that I guess the largest expenses are upon us. Forest to market. Just before I start talking on this, this was actually drawn freehand by our very own in-house artist, Rox. I think she's done a fantastic job of doing that. So well done, Rox. Anyway, so forest to markets. You'll see the hauler sitting up there. Up there, pulling the logs to the landings, and as each landing has a set size, they have a certain capacity of logs that they can hold, and that capacity can't be breached. So it's really important that good logistics are a part of moving logs, and you'll see the truck there. The truck rolls up to the landing and takes those logs to their destination. That'll either be a domestic mill up in here. When we sell to domestic mills, it's sold in dollars per tonne. Trucks go over a weighbridge, and we get those weights get sent to the FMNZ office and collated. And if they're not going to domestic, they'll go to export. Okay. If they go to export, they go through a scaling yard, and we'll see this today. We'll be driving through it, but the scaling yard here, the logs get scaled. They get scaled in what's called, what we refer to as JAS, or Japanese Agriculture Standard. It's a cubic metre measurement that's based on small end diameter, and all logs that go via, or to the export markets are sold in that cubic metre measurement. When they come out of that scaling yard, they go over a weighbridge, and we get those weights as well. So we actually have a conversion factor. We use that to compare it to, I guess, what we're selling to the domestic market. From there, they go to the port down here, and depending on what export company you use, we use two here in the Hawke's Bay. Summit's here presenting today, which we find we've got a fairly good relationship with, and they do the business well. Each exporter has a set area at the port where they've got, I guess, a finite amount of logs they can hold. So ports are all about vessel movements. If you don't have vessels moving logs, it all backs up. But it's also about trying to maximise the loads on those vessels, because it gets negotiated on volumes, and so they've got to try and use their port capacity without breaching to, I guess, get the best price from freight. But they can't breach their capacity. If we suddenly get into a situation where the vessel is late, it backs up all the way back up the chain. And that happens with log truck movements as well. We rely heavily on those trucks pulling logs off that skid. If the trucks aren't pulling those logs off that skid in a timely fashion, two things happen. Your harvest cost will go up because the contractor can't maximise his potential of the equipment that he's got, or he goes broke. Now, whether it's vessel movements we're referring to or truck movements, those two scenarios to the contrary simply can't happen. So logistics plays a very, large component of the whole infrastructure we set up. In fact, just after the end of our presentation, I think we're going to take a few questions, but then we're going to show you a promotional video that we've got for FMNZ that actually outlines this whole process just before we go to morning tea. Okay, this is a monthly Agrifax graph that tracks New Zealand log prices in dollars per tonne over the last 10 years. Some of you would have seen this before, and you can see by the graph that we operate in a reasonably volatile market. Markets will go up and down throughout the clearfell harvest. You can see the last couple of years have been fairly good, but you can note in 2015 that was a pretty tough year. So with markets, and this is when I'll start to talk about infrastructure and continuity, because during the harvest, the average, say, 250 hectare forest is going to take about 2.5 maybe to 3 years to harvest, depending on the contractor's ability and tonnage he does. So we've got time there, but the average markets, we will go through some highs and lows, and we have to work on those averages. We've got to try and maximise at the highs and minimise volumes in the lows. And when we're in that low dip, we will call on all our kind of service providers to try and trim costs somewhere, try and reduce tonnage, but we have to keep the infrastructure going. We cannot turn off. And I've been saying this for 3 or 4 years of talking to you about harvesting, and I will continue to say it, because if we have a turn-off mentality, it simply won't happen. Contractors won't work for us, we won't get the job done, and the infrastructure will fall down. However, we have to, like I say, minimise the volumes at low times and maximise at high times, and so there's mechanisms we use to try and do that. Given that 70% of probably our volume, 70 to 80% of our volume is currently going to export, and the prices rise up and down on that Chinese market. So, and that 70% that's going to export, or in fact here in the Hawke's Bay we're at about 80% is going to export. That is simply because the domestic mills only require set grades. So at the moment Pan Pac require pruned and pulpwood and binwood. So we need that export market. We certainly don't need any tariffs put on it. And just to give you an example, we started in that 2015 year, we started our Waikiri forest in February 2015. It's 420 hectare forest. We look like we'll be finishing the clearfell of that early next year. That forest there started in February 2015, and in March the price dropped. We just bought a contractor over from the Hawke's Bay. He's a good contractor, and he is doing a good job out there. But we bought him over in February. They moved families over to the west coast to do at the Waikiri forest. Price dropped, it plummeted in April, dropped in March, plummeted in April, and then you can see it was there for, looking at that graph in that 2015 year, it was there for a little while. That was pretty tough times, and we had some quite robust discussion, I guess, with some of the shareholders and with Roger's office, and obviously we're trying to keep that ticking along. Some of the actual return dropped down to as low as about $8,000 per hectare. Okay, this over there, Waikiri, was forecast, because it's got quite a distance to port, and it's different than a lot of our forests here, at about that just over 16,000 net return per hectare. It dropped down quite low. We managed through that low time. Prices picked up, and that forest now is sitting at about 9,000 ahead of where it was predicted on the budgeted figure. So it's been a good result. If we had have cut it off, that contractor would have gone broke. No one will take him on during a low time, or we would start to get a bad name for turning off and on. We had a similar experience with our Oban forest too, and that, I think, ended up about $13,000 on average above its predicted budget. So, challenges within the industry, attracting and retaining staff. I've already been talking a little bit on that, but we need to attract and retain good crews. You know, our scale is our point of difference, and it's that scale that will attract those crews, okay? But we must provide that continuity. The other thing that we need to do is we have to be relatively fluid in our approach to that workload. So if we forecast the clearfell to start, say, of June of any particular calendar year, and that contractor comes available 2 months prior, that's when we must start that. We will start the tender documents prior to that. We'll have an idea of the contractors that will go into that. But we can't just say, oh no, we're not forecast to start till June. Sorry, you're going to have to wait, because he'll go to someone else. The opposite to that, of course, is if it's 2 months after, so be it. That's when we must start that contractor. And some of you will get budgets that we predict where the costs are going to come in, and you start kind of building your lives around the return, which is all good. But if there's a change in that, it's an estimate, it is a prediction. Okay, so that we have to be a little bit fluid in that arrangement. Continuity is the only way to deal with that. Industry image. Attracting workers to the forest industry is really vital to the success of our business. And as a larger group of foresters companies, we've done it poorly in this arena, and we recognise this in the Hawke's Bay Forest Group and FOA. We know we've done poorly at attracting staff. You know, everyone hears the negative stories about forestry. You know, that it's a dangerous industry, it's, you know, really not for us, and I don't want my kid to be involved with it. We know that we're drastically underrepresented at high school level. Forestry doesn't come into the curriculum until year 11, and horticulture and agriculture come in at year 9. So that kind of thing needs to change, and as an industry we need to push towards that, because we desperately need to attract people to our industry. Rory showed you an operator on that processor, but a guy who's good at his job, who can produce the tonnes, turn up day in, day out, drug-free, will earn over $100,000 a year. I would have thought that was pretty good. Anyway, we've got to sing the good news stories. Health and safety. I won't dwell on this too much. We've talked about it at length at plenty of meetings, but FMNZ has a robust, up-to-date health and safety policy. We have a staff member who's dedicated to our health and safety policy, and she does a fantastic job of owning that. And it's about, like I say, we've updated our policy and procedures around the 2015 legislation, but health and safety is always under constant review. I guess the key thing for investors is, you know, am I exposed from a health and safety perspective? We've had this question at the last meeting. But in the 2015 legislation, one of the key points is about the ability to control and influence the place of work. So I guess as landowners, as a PCBU, you are a PCBU in your own right, but you don't have the ability to control and influence the place of work. The contractor has that. As a PCBU in his own right. We have that as a management company on your behalf. We're a PCBU in our own right, and we take on that responsibility collectively and take on that health and safety responsibility. Environmental. Now, this is becoming an interesting subject. You know, plantation forestry, as we all know, is hugely important to New Zealand's environment. We know that forests contribute to the stabilisation of soils, reduction in erosion and sedimentation. We know it improves the water quality. That photo there on the left-hand side is an example of a forest versus farmland, and in a storm event, how good trees are. However, at harvesting, that can change. And it's really important that we implement best practice so as we meet any environmental kind of issues that we come across. So, currently here in the Hawke's Bay, we operate a self-regulated system. Okay, that's all changing with the introduction of the National Environmental Standard, or the NES, and the NES was introduced to set a standard across the country that everyone works to. It'll be interesting to see how it does work. It comes into effect May next year. Okay, and it covers off in forestry 8 core plantation forestry activities: afforestation, pruning, and thinning, earthworks, river crossings, harvesting, mechanical prep, and replanting. Okay, now all of these activities are permitted in the NES. However, there is strict criteria we have to meet around that, and that criteria will change depending on the land classification. Land is classified into 4 categories based on its erosion susceptibility, and that is low, medium, high or very high, or green, yellow, orange and red, depending on how you look at the map. And so those, like I say, those categories will vary. Right, public perception of our industry. We see on the media, from time to time about debris movement and radiata on beaches, but public perception of our industry is a key point in our social licence to operate. We have to portray a good industry. It's the environment we're currently in, and we do take that quite seriously. So it's about us making sure we follow best practice. It's about us ticking off the how do we know. So when we get asked the question, how do we know you've compacted that to a standard, and how do we know you've benched that? We need to be able to prove that, and so our contractors take regular photos, daily diary entries, so as we can provide the proof, I guess, of what it is we're doing. As you can see there, this is a picture at our Waipapa forest. It's a steep area. Actually, the photo doesn't probably do it justice, but there's a river right there, and it's really about removing as much material off-site as you can and getting that, and that's where your pulp and your bin wood comes in. So we've got the luxury here of the pan pack mill. Now, you don't get much of a return off that. In fact, we have a differential rate we put on our contractors to, so one, that they have to remove that material, but we get it at a discounted rate to encourage production of higher grades. I'll just go back actually. Okay, you can see that photo in the bottom right hand corner there. That's a harvesting job that's not ours, I will add quickly. But that there is extremely poor harvest practice. There's a lot of debris sitting in that creek that is ready to mobilise down off-site and really upset someone. So those kind of techniques and practice are just totally unacceptable in our industry. But debris mobilising off-site is nothing new. If you look at that centre photo, that's off the Wainui beach north of Gisborne back in the 1800s. It wasn't radiata, it was native logs. So we're in a different environment though, and I guess we have to kind of manage that environment. Yeah, so social licence to operate, it is a real thing. There will be some times, I guess, when we get a weather bomb that creates a problem and debris may well mobilise off-site. We will get judged on how we react to that. And I guess what I mean by that is we can't go, it's not my problem, shrug our shoulders, act of God. It's just that kind of attitude's not acceptable. We will have to do something quite quickly in helping to clean up any issue we may have. But there's things we can do to try and prevent things like that, debris catchers we can set up, etc. Anyway, something to think about for the NES. Once we start our roadlining, you can expect to see a roadline report that looks like this. The first bullet point there will cover off work completed for that month. Okay, and the second bullet points, it'll be income and expenditure to date cumulatively. Okay, so this here is, like I say, it's just an activity report. You'll get it monthly when we are carrying out the road lining. And we will also, it'll be pretty much a one-pager, maybe a couple of photos, so nothing too elaborate, but just points out where we're going and what we're doing, so as you've got an understanding of that. The harvest proceeds will get used or retained to put in the roads, to build the infrastructure. When we're in a good market like we currently are, we will pay out dividends when we feel we can, but we need to retain those funds to build the roads. But you'll see all that in your report, so you get that on a monthly basis while we're working in the forest carrying out the road lines. When we start the clearfell, you'll get a lot more robust report, and that report will give you a detailed of all your costs and revenues to date and grade recoveries. It will include actual versus your cash flow or predicted, and as you get closer to harvest, we give you a predicted at the AGMs because obviously markets go up and down, and we try to work on average data. So you'll get that as we get closer to your harvest, and that will be the benchmark, what we're trying to achieve for you as an investor. And we will also bring in the road line, all the expenditure and income from that road line to include in that report. And in that report, like I say, you've got maps. We do a buyer-created invoice, bit of a market commentary. It's a very transparent document. We pride ourselves on that transparency. We know that these documents get into some of our competitors. We do operate in that private sector as well. It's not just the RDL group, and there's nothing we can do about that. We distribute it out. Where you distribute it to is totally up to you. But transparency is first and foremost in our mind. Replanting. Leaving the land fallow is not an option. We talked about this at the 2014 conference. We believe it would devalue your land. Well, in fact, we know it will devalue your land, and we're simply not going to leave it fallow. So we are going to replant. In some cases, that is mandatory, but it is our intention to replant as we work our way through the harvest. And we tend to work to about December, maybe early January. And we try to cut off the planting year around that time to allow us to prepare the ground for the planting the following June. So we try to work to a reasonably good geographic location, but we will be planting as we're going through it. We will identify that separately as well from any costs associated from your income that you're receiving from harvesting, because we're trying to finish off the first project. But it will be a cost, and it is going to happen. Key messages. So I'll just, I guess, go over the last key messages. Significant benefits from economy of scale. You know, as I touched on that before, we've got some large expenditures coming up, and that economy of scale is your single point of difference over a lot of woodlots. We were probably 50% of the plantings on this between Gisborne and in fact on this east coast at the time we planted in the 90s, and so we definitely need to kind of call on that economy of scale. Like I say, large expenses, and we negotiate that with all our service providers. Harvesting cannot be turned off and on as markets fluctuate. I will continue to go on about this every time I talk to you about harvesting. Yeah, I'll be like a broken record, and might upset Roger a bit, but too bad. That's all right. So anyway, we're going to continue to talk about that. It's got to happen. Increasing safety and efficiencies through technology. Rory's shown you some of the technologies we use. We need to embrace those technologies for labour shortages, and obviously we need to try and get people off the ground and into machines for safety reasons. Sound infrastructure and logistics along with good supply chain relationships is key. Logistics are a massive component to it, and And it is about relationships with your harvesting contractors, all your service providers, your exports, your domestic markets. It is about those relationships. And you will call on those relationships during tough times. FMNZ and your investment. FMNZ's reason for being and the reason you invested in forestry is here, I guess, with the harvest. We've had a core group of loyal individuals that you've seen year after year. And I'd like to think that's made you feel comfortable with your investment. Looking back, we know we're proud of what we've achieved, of the quality of the forest we've produced, and we know that we've set them up well going into this harvest to try and get the best return for you. As we turn the chapter, I guess to harvest, we face new challenges. It's not going to be easy. In fact, it is quite a challenge, but with the right attitude, we know it's achievable. And we're getting new staff on board. I certainly hope that they enjoy the challenge to come as we've enjoyed getting here. I'm going to lastly leave you with this. This has been our mission statement for 20 years, or almost 20 years, and never before has this been a truer statement than right now. To maximise the potential of every forest we manage in an environmentally, socially and economically sustainable manner. Thank you.